Good afternoon. Welcome to the third part of Holland Knight's New York Real Estate Trends webinar series. I am Stuart Saft, a partner in Holland Knight and the New York Real Estate Practice Group leader. This is the third year in which we have been presenting webinars. In 2021, we did two webinars on the Florida condominium disaster and whether New York City buildings could collapse the same way. And the result was increased awareness of the issues in New York that need to be addressed, including garages. In 2022, immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine and the federal government imposed sanctions, we did two webinars on the impact of the sanctions on New York real estate. Earlier this year, we did a webinar entitled Adaptive Reuse, Converting Office Buildings to Residential Use. And last month, we did one on converting rental apartment buildings to condominiums. All of our prior webinars and this one are available for reviewing on Holland Knight's website. Today's webinar is called Creating Value, Distressed Condominiums and Commercial Conversions. Joining me today are Beth Fisher, Senior Managing Director, Corcoran Sunshine Marketing, who will discuss the current market and what can be done to improve the marketability of a building or project that is distressed and has been taken over by a new owner or lender. Peter Varsalona, a Principal and Vice President of Rand Engineering and Architecture, who will discuss the kind of physical review that should be undertaken when a new owner takes over, even though the original plan contains a detailed description of the property. Peter will also discuss modifying units to meet buyers' demands in a changing market. Robert Pollack of Marcus & Pollack, who will discuss the property's real estate taxes and ways to reduce costs. My colleague, Rachel Katz, will discuss what should be done to a prior offering plan that a prior sponsor had prepared in order to re-enter the market. I will then discuss specific issues in both taking over distressed projects and reimagining office and other buildings. Finally, we will take Q&A. CLE credit will be available for this session, and you will be advised on how to obtain it during the presentation. I want to thank my law firm, Holland Knight, and Joe Gay, the real estate section leader, as well as Mike Haig, Lauren Faulkner, Kayla Thompson, and Minview for their assistance in putting on these webinars. Let me tee up the presentation by noting that in the last year, we have clients who have taken over 6 condo projects that were having difficulties, and we were able to reimagine them, significantly alter the structure, the finances, the presentation, and the offering plan, and are reintroducing them to the market with more positive results. Additionally, in the last decade, we've assisted clients in reimagining 1.2 million square feet of Manhattan office buildings, plus buildings in the outer boroughs, Nassau and Suffolk County, into other uses, including residential, hospitality, medical, and educational. To paraphrase Robert Kennedy's statement, some people see things the way they are and ask why, while here at H&K, we see things as they could be and ask why not. In the case of reuse of buildings, there is no limit on how buildings built for the 19th or 20th century can be transformed to provide for the needs of 21st century New York and beyond. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Beth Fisher, Senior Managing Director of Corcoran Sunshine Marketing Group.
Thank you, Stuart. Well, that's certainly an impressive body of work that you guys have achieved. And it's so important to reuse these existing assets also just in terms of sustainability. I mean, I just heard yesterday that the carbon it takes to build a building, you spend that much to take it down, and only about 10 to 15% of those materials can be recycled. So, for many, many reasons, economic and others, it's really important to think about how we can reimagine these assets. So Thanks for having me. I'm sure there's a lot of our friends on the phone, and for those who don't know Corcoran Sunshine and me, it's nice to meet you. Uh, as Stuart said, what we're really talking about today are ways to create value with underperforming assets. And by way of background, Corcoran Sunshine has been at this for 30 years. We have $58 billion worth of transactions under our belt, and this is where we brag a little bit. Once again, named the top performing new development company in New York. That's been every year since those rankings have been around. And remarkably, we performed 43% of the new development transactions that occurred last year, which is more than double our nearest competitor. So we have enormous access to data and information, and that's really a hallmark of what we bring to this process for our clients. So while we're very proud of all the top performers we represent, we actually got our start working for failed condominiums. That's how the party got started about 30 years ago. You might be very surprised to hear this, but back in the 90s, people like Donald Trump had a tremendous amount of trouble with their banks. And we had the pleasure to work with lenders during those years to figure out how to reposition these assets and to look at what we think of as really the 3 Ps: pricing, product, and promotion. These are sort of the buckets and lenses that we use in terms of diagnosing what the challenge is. And with these buildings, you're quite lucky if the only problem is price. On the other hand, you sort of hate, and when you start a development, you want to make sure that you have many more levers to pull, that you aren't left with just price, that you've created something that has a unique position in the market that really can't be replicated, and you're not just creating a commodity that is going to be just really only going to have to transact based upon the basic pricing values. So somewhere along the line with an underperforming asset, 1, 2, or 3 of those factors, price, promotion, or product, are not aligned with market expectations. So let's frame this challenge. Of the roughly 12,000 transactions that happen annually, only around 2,000 of those are in new development. And you might be shocked to hear that of the 200 developments on the market, 80 of them, 80, do 0 deals at all. They don't do any. So, and of our inventory, and there's roughly 5,000 to 6,000 units on the market in new development inventory, about half of that are underperformers. So there's sort of this stockpiling of underperforming assets. And, unfortunately, that does point to there being some real signs of distress in some of these areas. So the top performing buildings, and I'm going to brag a little bit here to say that we represent most of them. In the top 10, we generally represent 6 or 7 every year. And 2 years ago, those buildings were transacting at the rate of 5 units per month. And probably a lot of you are thinking, oh, well, I performed in that on my building. I'm going to do that too. Well, maybe not, because this year those top performers are doing 3 deals per month. So the market transaction volumes are down around 13% year over year. So again, this is a very competitive market. There's a lot out there, and not everybody is going to get a piece of the action. This is really a market of winners and losers. So right now, what we are quite busy with is, once again, our phones are ringing from who? Back from the lenders, our friends, the lenders, who really want us to get involved so that we can provide the analytics that are needed and perhaps reposition the marketing to achieve better pricing. And so let's talk about some of those specific case studies and how we can really help. Well, with regard to pricing, people are rather simplistic in terms of the way they look at pricing. And I actually love Gary Barnett's quote to me. He used to say, oh, comps, Beth, all you guys want to do is look in the rearview mirror, years ago. And I thought, well, that's true. That would be a really bad way to give someone information. We need to also look ahead of us and understand pipeline, and also what is happening with all this shadow inventory that's sitting on the sidelines that is not moving. But we can't just look in a broad way. I'm sure you've all been at cocktail parties, or you're talking to your developer clients and friends and saying, oh, we're going to get 3,000 a foot. We're going to get 21 a foot. I hate when people start throwing those numbers around, because guess what? The base of your building is maybe going to get $1,700 a square foot, the top of your building is maybe going to get 34, but what percent of your square footage is in either of those categories? Where are you really going to blend? Have you really done the math, or are we just kind of throwing numbers around? So we're going to look at this by segmenting the inventory by line and by type and by months of supply to really try to understand within each of those categories how things are performing and what really needs to happen. And sometimes it can be as simple as looking at things, and this is sort of basic stuff, that if you have your one bedrooms all priced at over $1.5 million, you might do very well to put some that are, under $1.5 million. So sometimes there's just some simple little tweaks, and sometimes we have to decide strategically if this is a rip the Band-Aid off and have kind of a wholesale repricing strategy. By the way, Stuart, are we still under the executive order, or do you have to file amendments on price changes? Do you know? Oh, he muted himself. This is what I get for calling people out.
The AG's COVID regulations are still in effect.
So isn't that great? We don't have to
Yeah.
file amendments, although supposedly we have to do a cleanup amendment, right?
Yes.
I hope so. Is anyone going to do that? Okay. Don't remind me.
Well,
But-
we sometimes do them when we feel there's a very important issue that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic thing. I love that executive order that you can modify pricing. You don't necessarily have to amend, yet you may strategically find that it's very important to have those down arrows and street easy indicate to the world and signal that a particular developer is more forward-looking in terms of transactions. So again, like a deeper dive, that pricing beyond comps, months of supply, also a deeper dive into the target market. Is the promotion really targeting the kind of people that are walking through the door today? Is your marketing team advising you on what percent of people are buying in cash versus financing today? Those numbers have changed. They've swung about 15% over the past couple of quarters. Are you sensitive to that? How is that being addressed? And also keeping in mind that right now in the market, there is a tremendous generational transfer of wealth. It is staggering how many parents we see buying for kids. And that means that your building positioning has to appeal to someone who is 50, 60, 70, as well as someone who is 20, 30, 40. And so keeping in mind that we don't want to be too polarizing with our buildings, even if they're on the Lower East Side and they want to be cool and we have a cool graffiti logo. I have one of those. I'm super proud of that building, but nevertheless, I have to make sure that I'm making the parents that are buying for those kids feel that their kids are going to be in a place where they can be safe and achieve. So how are we really addressing those psychographic needs? Not just, who are the demographics? It's really the why. Who are they? What do they want? What's the why here? Why are they going to transact? So that's some of the basic stuff in pricing. I mean, there's a whole lot more there. Then there's promotion. We get calls all the time because somehow the marketing plan really isn't aligning. And look, there's sort of, on one hand, you can't really market your way out of a pricing problem, I'm sorry to tell you, but sometimes you need to really rip the Band-Aid off with a very bad marketing idea. And we've taken over quite a few buildings like this. And, just some examples without really calling anybody out too much. There was a big building that had some Roman numerals on it recently. I'm not going to get into too many details. There was years ago a building that was named after a spa in Arizona. Apparently nobody wanted that on York Avenue. The costs were really high. This comes into what Bob's going to be talking about. Are you really looking at what those monthly costs are going to be? When you look at doing a hotel branded building, can you afford to carry that 3% licensing premium? Are you really going to be able to recoup that in terms of the value? Maybe yes, maybe no. Sometimes people will say, do I need a architect? Well, if you're on Billionaires Row, you bet you do. And there's probably an expectation of hotel services too. So in terms of what premium you're going to get for that hotel, guess what? Maybe zero. Maybe that's just what the market expects. On the other hand, we talk about some challenges we've had in our own portfolio. Many years ago, in 2009, we got a call from a new developer. Phone wasn't ringing a lot in 2009, and we decided to take on this little boutique development with a young developer who had a lot of passion for a particular Pritzker Prize winning architect that he wanted to do a small development in Lower Manhattan. And this Pritzker Prize winner, was not very motivated based on commercial results. He was an artiste, and he insisted that we do duplex residences for every single apartment in this old cast iron building. We did study after study about how people really don't want to be walking up those stairs with kind of nobody wants duplexes in the city mostly, unless you have outdoor space. That's a whole other story. But anyway, Despite an enormous amount of information, this developer embarked on this strategy to appease an architect, not really looking back to what the market expectations were, and proceeded to build a building where, in creating those duplexes, a lot of the structural integrity of the building was undermined. They needed to put in a Varandale truss to hold the thing up. Needless to say, it didn't go well. It took 10 years to build. And, you know, sometimes people they just don't want to listen. If I can say one thing on this webinar, please listen. I mean, the market data is really, it's out there for us to really value and to really pay attention and to bring a lot of ingenuity to the process, but you sort of can't defy what some of these, you know, basic market tenets are. And just like one quick other story on rebranding, my very favorite is Manhattan House, and just such a wonderful outcome, because here you had a beautiful building. It was, you know, being marketed based on Grace Kelly having lived there, I think was the prior firm's campaign. And we looked at it and we said, you know, marketing needs to be truthful and it needs to resonate. And the big objection here is that this is a white brick building on the Upper East Side. Who lives in one of those? I do. Anyway, the point is, what we did is we made that an icon, and we had a campaign about live in an icon and brought it back to its Gordon Bunshoft heritage as this important SOM example of mid-century architecture. What is better than that? So very proud to take credit of turning white brick buildings into being super cool on the Upper East Side. That's good. Hopefully they won't all have pointing problems. And lastly, with regard to product, and, you know, I think Peter's going to talk a whole lot about that more. You know, certainly you do have times where the unit mix is just really not aligning with market expectations. And, you know, there certainly have been buildings that have been built very ambitiously for all very large homes, and it can be pretty tough to make those into smaller residences. It's a little bit easier to combine smaller homes because you have those plumbing stacks and such. You just can't, if you have a big giant apartment, you know, you want to make it into two, you still need bathrooms and kitchens, and that might not be easy in your 60 by 40 living room. So we have a very robust planning team, and we will look through the lens when we're doing conversions, for example, office to resi, and we've done about 60 of those, office or warehouse to resi, where we're going to look at everything. And even in a recent residential conversion, we're going to examine everything from the facade down to the doorknobs and really benchmark market expectations. And how can we create value with some of those, you know, some of those improvements to the property? So that would be an entire other webinar that my colleague Elisa would do, who's so incredible and teaches at Columbia Planning. She's spectacular. So that's really, you know, kind of gives you a taste of the various lenses that we look through in terms of benchmarking an asset and creating value for our clients. So hope that was helpful.
It was very helpful. I want to also congratulate you on the job you did on Manhattan House. It was one of our favorite projects, and not just because we had to deal with two separate tenant groups, but you're right. You really came in and saved the day. I just want to ask you one question.
Tricia Cole did that job, and she did a great job.
Yeah, I just want to ask you one question, and that is, we are regularly seeing people now sitting on the sidelines because interest rates are high and prices are a little softer. Isn't this the best time for people to buy? Because yes, the interest rate is high, but they're not going to hold that mortgage for 30 years. In 2 years, when interest rates are lower, they'll go in and refinance. Do you see much of this inflexibility because interest rates have gone up?
It's a great question. I think what we saw last year was that the first 2 quarters were pretty strong. And by the middle of the second quarter, once those rate hikes became acute, the market really hit the pause button. And as we've seen so many times, when there's some kind of an event, whether it's the stock market or, you know, some of the other events we've been through as a city, often the market hits the pause button. And that's really where there's a disconnect between buyer and seller. And that happened during the last 2 quarters of last year. And then sellers really started to adjust pricing and saying, you know, these buyers are just not coming back. And it is always kind of that tension. So the market has picked back up close to the level that it was in early 2022. And hopefully we're on track and people are recognizing that there is value. We're most encouraged by the amount of traffic that's out there. So I think that the consumers are reading the opportunity that you're discussing, and that it absolutely is a great time to buy, particularly in buildings that are the newer launches where you can still select the floor, the view, and you have, such a wonderful opportunity to really take advantage of all they have to offer. So.
Thank you.
Right.
And now Peter Varsalona.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk on this very esteemed panel. I want to share my screen since I have some slides to present. All right, I hope everyone can see that. That's me. So just 2 moments on Rand. Rand is a full service engineering and architecture firm. We started in 1987. We administer about 60 million in construction annually, and we've worked on over 19,000 projects since our inception. Rand is a building doctor firm, right? So we specialize in repair, rehabilitation of existing building stock. We've done so many conversions. We've done quite a few developments and again, it tends to be my greatest interest is adaptive reuse of existing buildings. So that we've seen just about every type of building, and our base of operations really is New York City focused. So that's our passion. We have such a great old building stock in New York City that can be constantly reimagined. And as I said, we cover the full gamut of services. Conversion opportunities really kind of break it into 3 different groups, right? You got, I hate the word failed, maybe struggling residential condos, right? That backlog that Beth was talking about, the existing commercial buildings that we want to convert to residential. And then as a white box, could be a commercial, an old factory building or manufacturing that is considering converting to residential. I kind of outlined several steps that are really key, at least from an architect and engineering standpoint, towards successful conversions. And it doesn't really matter whether it's one that's already converted and needs a reimagining, or one that's in construction and is struggling and is stopped, or one that you're considering. And the key is to immediately assess the existing conditions and develop existing condition plans. Really critical if it's something new. You want to get existing plans, architectural, MEP, structural. You really need the base information in order to make critical decisions. It's also critical to do an environmental review based on where your building is located. It may have certain environmental restrictions, such as noise, and such as environmental soil that really can impact your decision. You may have oil tanks or old diesel tanks in the building that you need to get rid of if you're doing such a conversion. You really have to kind of factor it in. You must navigate the zoning regulations for a property, right? So you're obviously converting from commercial to residential, or commercial mixed use, could be community facility, could be hotel, all have big factors and impact to how a conversion will flow. Also critical to do a massing study, right? Relatively low cost investment for someone considering a property. And it's not just for ones that exist. Not every building is overbuilt. A lot of buildings have unused and undeveloped air rights that can really factor in. And I'll have some examples of some massing studies to show. But really critical, because if you're really trying to convert to residential, and this goes into the marketing aspect of the property, you really have to know, what are my options, particularly if I can raise the height of a building in an area, or I can change the layout. If there's anything that you can take home with this webinar today, you have to get the marketing aspect involved, right? And I'm not just tipping my hat to Beth, but in all of our projects, it's really critical to know what the market trends are. Years ago, we work with a developer, we would do everything, do the designs, we would do our own research, we would come up with a product, build it, and then bring the marketer in to try to sell what was built, okay? And then, what could go wrong with that process, right? So critical, you know how many projects where marketing come in and said, oh, good Lord, your unit mix is a real problem, or you don't have enough closets, the bathrooms are incorrect, the layouts. And I can tell you, you don't need to be a star architect to make those errors. If you're not knowing, you need to get the direct input from marketing because they're the ones speaking to buyers, right? You want to design and build something people want to buy, right? Real basic, but you can lose sight of it. You can lose focus. And Beth gave a great example earlier of that type of lost focus on what the end game is, right? You're looking to move product. You're looking to sell apartments. You're looking to build a community that of different where people can live in. The unit mix is so important. And I've seen so many that don't have really good mixes. And that can be critical in a reimagining of a condominium that isn't selling, right? There's a reason it's not selling. Engaging, again, critically, this should be obvious. You got to have an experienced marketing team, legal team, right? There's a lot of legal aspects. You may have to, usually you got to amend offering plans. You got to restate them. Accounting team also really critical. Designing for optimal space. Many commercial or factory buildings have some dead spaces. They got to be how do you factor them in? You can have some weird, quirky layouts. Not every building should be converted. Okay, there are some cases where, this is not a good candidate, but there are ways where you can expand and increase the residential use or amenity space in buildings. We'll talk a little bit about that. And again, developing a work scope and budget that's detailed, that is accurate. There are ways many developers do this for various different conversions. Many construction management companies can provide this service, called pre-construction services. They can really work for that budget, but it's critical. Everybody on the team has to buy into that price point for what we're going to build for. So you got to know what it is, right? You can't keep it a secret from people. No, the team has to know, what are we building for, so that we can work towards it, we can substitute as needed, and we can have something that's in a viable financial plan. And obviously corroboration and adaptability, right? You got to be able to corroborate with so many different professionals. This is a big team that has to be able to pull this off, and you got to be adaptable to everybody's concerns. You got to be able to work a product that can work for your site, for your specific needs on that building. So this is a kind of a critical slide about what we think is really important for the planning phase. Things real quickly on assessing existing conditions. You want to do a full survey, right? This is more than due diligence, right? If you're looking to buy a building. No, this is, you really need to assess not only the structural integrity, the systems, the envelope, the foundation, for where they stand now, right? Because we're not looking to knock this building down. We're looking to salvage it. All the sins of the past have to now be addressed. You have to fix things, that all the deferred maintenance. You're gonna have to figure where you are and what can you do. You may decide, I'm going to keep the floors, but the facade of that white glazed brick that's failing might have to come down and put something, dare I say it, more contemporary. Or maybe it is in really good condition, and that is the selling point, and we want to keep it. We want to keep traditional windows and not go with a curtain wall system. MEP systems, you really got to know what's salvageable or not. I've seen buildings where commercial owners, tenants come in, one building in particular comes to mind where all the 7 floors were occupied by one tenant. They put all new systems in up on the roof, VRF systems, and that tenant failed. Well, what do? Those systems are in really good condition. They could be reused in a residential component or occupancy. Envelope, obviously, if you're subject to New York City Local Law 10 and 11, or what we call FISP, generally the building isn't relatively being maintained. And hopefully that is not a big animal for you. But again, it's one of those things that I find in my 36 years of doing this is you have to make sure a building is leak free. You got to solve it. It's got to be able to hold water. Many of the old building stocks, they've already solved their problems, right? Sometimes the newer buildings are the worst. So, again, as part of the overall assessment, and obviously you have to have a stable building. You got to make sure that any settling or other issues have been stabilized. Interior finishes tend to be completely ripped out, although there may be certain components in an existing building, a fancy lobby or something that can be adaptively reused. Accessibility, since you're converting or changing use, got to satisfy ADA. That is clear cut. There is no exemption to that. New York City, it's local local 58. Code compliance, obviously, that should be easy, right? No, it's not easy. Existing building stock or buildings built in the 20s or 50s, different codes, right? As an architect, you can choose the 38, the 68, or the 2022 code. But on life safety systems, you got to satisfy per 2022 code. A lot more stringent, right? So you're going to have to upgrade systems to accommodate the residential occupancy. Egress. I've been in many old buildings, whether it's wet manufacturing, commercial, that do not have egress that satisfies current code. You may note that old fire tower in the back of the building, that ain't gonna work, with a re-entry at the mezzanine level. No, that's gonna have to be ripped out. You're gonna have to put in interior fire stairs. The only good thing is residential still allows scissor stairs, whereas commercial did not. So you have some opportunities there. I mentioned before, environmental factors, asbestos, lead paint, all things that you would otherwise have to deal with. If you're in an area that has environmental restrictions, you're going to need to develop a remedial action plan. Utilities, hopefully, if you have an old building that it was commercial, generally speaking, the power, water, sprinkler, all those things are already usually pretty robust. You'll probably have to do distribution upgrades, but hopefully you won't have to do much in terms of utility upgrading. Scope and budgeting are critical. We talked a little bit about it. I wanted to emphasize the financial planning aspect of it, right? It's really got to provide a broad overview. It's got to cover all the different disciplines, requirements for soft and hard costs. Stakeholders all have to have buy-in to what that number is. You have to be able to prove that this is a viable investment. And I think having a clear-cut idea on scope and budget is critical. I mentioned navigating zoning regulations, right? So a zoning study is one of the first things you generally do. You want to ensure compliance with whatever area you're in New York City, and you want to know what those restrictions are. And it can get quite complicated. Some owners will hire an expert. Even architects will go, you know what, I'm going to hire somebody who is just an expert in this, particularly in certain areas. There's obviously setback regulations, there's mechanical space allowances you can take deductions for. So if you have a commercial building that has a lot of those, that can help you reallocate square footage for residential use. You want to maximize that residential square footage. It's really critical to the success of the project. Creating ADA compliance, obviously you got to create accessible spaces, right? You're looking to adhere to ADA. And again, once you decide to convert to residential, you're in that zone. You cannot avoid it. You want to obtain certificates, get the permits to validate that you show compliance. Many times as a design, one of the persons on that design team is an ADA consultant, somebody who is just looking at these items to ensure compliance. Interior accessibility features. Again, you want to make sure that sometimes in an existing building, even in ones that have been converted, the locations of things are not so convenient. So whether it's a common area corridor or an elevator, you're going to need to comply. Newer things that are more recent that you have to now be concerned about, right? So energy and sustainability, Beth talked a little bit about this, but Local 197 applies to all buildings over 25,000 square feet. That's a lot of our developments, right? So you can't use, it would be unfortunate if you're trying to still use buildings that are using fossil fuels to feed their heating and air conditioning systems or hot water systems. So if you have a building that's still using a gas boiler, that might be something that you really want to focus in on. You may want to find a location where you can put a centralized air conditioning system or a condenser farm. You basically want to electrify. So in older buildings, electrical upgrading and insulation are the keys to satisfying this regulation to reduce your emissions and reduce fines and penalties, right? I think it would be very unattractive to a potential buyer if they're looking at potential fines associated with this new or restated condominium. So you're looking for energy efficiency, right? It's also a good marketing point, right? You want to buy into a building is energy efficient. You don't want to buy into a building that has a D on it, right? You want to buy into one that has an A. So you're looking at individualized controls for energy efficient HVAC systems, LED lights, of course, new energy efficient appliances, water saving devices. These are also what buyers generally want when we speak to them. Building envelope, right? You got to insulate. These old buildings had no insulation. So now you have to add that. And you want to explore those renewables that could be a potential both for energy savings, but also marketability, right? If you have solar panels or maybe a system where geothermal type option could be utilized. I mentioned massing studies. Massing studies are important because they give you as a developer or somebody who's looking to buy and reimagine an existing development that is struggling, you can look how you can change the building shape, its structure, its format, the light and air that can get to areas that may not have been so critical in a commercial or manufacturing use, but are ultimately the key for selling residential use. And it gives you, strategic placement, right? So you can see how I can, maybe if I have a 4-story building that has undeveloped rights, do I add one entire new floor with a setback? These are things that you look at. You could say, well, no, maybe I just build straight from there. You have different options, and that's why you want to work closely with the marketing to see what do owners want. Are terraces? Does everybody want an outdoor space or not? Does everybody, who wants balconies? Who wants different things depending on the building's location and who your market is tailored to? This is just like a quick example of one, right? So here's one that has undeveloped air rights. You see the one on the right, it's a 4-story building, and they decided, hey, let's add 2 floors and then just have one setback. We're working within the, right, we're bringing it up to the maximum height before we have to set back. The one on the left is a different example of the same type of building that could be constructed on this lot, where the setback happens at the 40-foot minimum. And then you have kind of a smaller miniature tower, but it gives more ability for light and air and more apartments to feel. You can market these as all penthouses. Like, it gives you the idea of just how you can use, and a massing study helps you with this, how you can use undeveloped air rights. Not every building, as I said, is overbuilt. We find many buildings that have unused air rights that can be incorporated into a program. Again, for optimizing space, we talked a little bit about repurposing underutilized spaces, basements, sub-basements. If these are clean, dry spaces, you can use it to add amenities. If you have commercial or manufacturing uses that have large corridor access or different rooms used for storage, they can be co-opted to be included into a residential or an amenity space on certain floors. Right, you want to fur out to these areas to create or add to a residential mix. Desirable amenities, and again, this also goes hand in hand with the marketing of a property. What are you designing for? Is this a boutique type condo? Is this a large building? There's be a large unit mix. What kind of amenities do you need to provide? Where are you located? Are you located where there's 17 gyms around you, or do you really need that if it's a 5-unit condo? Like, these are things, the decisions you have to make early on. When we discuss these and decide what are those spaces that you want to incorporate, right? Do you really need another laundry room besides the washer dryer closet you have in each apartment? Everybody wants storage. How much of that? Fitness rooms, do you really need that? It depends on the size of the building. It could be a very important amenity. Outdoor spaces tend to be very important, right? Owners like these. And there should be some common, right? Not everybody who just can afford the penthouse should be able to have an outdoor space access. Flexible spaces for meetings, conferences, recreation are really important. We see a lot more co-working spaces being added. And then you got these odd ones on the right, coffee shop, putting green. Those are weird things that kind of have to be taken with a grain of salt, right? Those are often the things that you immediately remove when you're trying to reimagine a condominium. Show renderings, really important. You want to be able to render so people can see what this is. This helps the entire design team. It helps greatly the marketing team as well in terms of what this is going to look like. What are you trying to achieve? You want to give that to potential purchasers. So visual representation help you. The technology is there for architects and engineers to really give you solid renderings, whereas before it was such a huge investment, the software is easier to manipulate. I'll leave you with this. This is a great example of a commercial building, right? And I'm not showing you existing, but assume it was a white box. You have an unfortunate placement of the elevator in the center. You have one stair and one fire escape. It's used for commercial, right? So I'm going to go to the first floor, the next slide. And you can see, well, what do I do, right? So, I have it, it's one tenant, it's gone. We're going to try to convert it to residential use. How could I possibly do that? So this is where you need that input from the marketing side. You need to know, like, this is just 2 options. You can have multiple options. What's my mix? Does it make sense to have 2 studios on the ground floor? Does it make sense to have a 2-bedroom here? How do I lay out the lobby with this unfortunate placement of the elevator, because we don't want to change that? And you'll notice that here we have the windows around the perimeter. So, right, there's no windows on the lot line wall. So you have to figure out your layout to accommodate that limitation. So bedrooms around the perimeter, make use of the light. Indoor spaces tend to, or inside spaces tend to be washer dryers, closets, bathrooms, things of that nature. Unit mixer is really important, right? In this case, it's more limited where we have 2 apartments before, but there's nothing to say you couldn't have 2 studios on certain floors. Maybe the bottom 3 floors have a studio in the back, 2 studios, and then 1 2-bedroom. It could be 1 bedrooms, right? So you want to have that mix of studio, 1 and 2 bedrooms in the building. Because it helps, I think, in terms of ensure the different type of mix and population. This particular building, and we don't show it here, but had a penthouse, so it's a setback penthouse. It can be used, the certain terrace space could be private, other could be used as a common element. The main roof is where you want to put your air conditioning equipment. VRF systems, there's a split systems really help with that. They give you more opportunity to lessen the size of mechanical rooms that might be necessary inside of a building. So these are just some of the things that you want to look into. The key focuses, though, and just in summary, existing, so you've got to have a really good handle on the on the building. You want to leverage your existing resources, right? You want to reduce cost, but you also want to maintain continuity if you can. Try, if you have a failed, or struggling condo or one that failed, you want to use the contractors that are still on board, the designers, because if you have to go backwards, it can be very costly. Obtaining plans can be very challenging and time consuming. You want to get marketing in place immediately. Really don't want. I've done jobs where I had to change plans so many times because the marketing changed multiple times during the design and construction. Can really set it back. So you want to get a strong marketing plan and follow that all the way through. It helps dictate how easy the construction is going to flow. And with that, I'll send it back to you, Sue.
Peter, thank you very much. Bob Pollack, you're on. You're mute. Bob?
Our firm is Marcus and Pollack. We practice exclusively in the area of real estate taxation in New York City. And as Beth spoke earlier, I never once heard from a marketing group that the taxes were appropriate. They're always too high, and they really are egregiously high. The law provides that condominiums are to be assessed as if they're rentals. So the city goes through an exercise of identifying what they think this building would be if it were a rental. They impute that into the building. They deduct what they believe ordinary operating expenses would be for a rental, and then they cap it at a rate of return they deem an investor would seek, and they utilize 45% of that indicated market value as the assessment. So assessments on relatively new buildings are generally running between $145 and $180 per gross square foot. So therein lies the rub. And the tax rate is 12.267%. So if I had an assessment at $175 a square foot, which is fairly common these days, applied by the tax rate, well, it would come out to $21.60 a square foot, but that's per gross square foot. Newer buildings tend to have more amenity space. There was a time when we'd see the buildings were essentially 80% efficient, wherein the sellable space represented 80% of the gross, but we don't see that anymore. We see 75 as more of a typical number. And under those situations, just running the math, I'm now up to $28.68 per sellable square foot per annum in real estate taxes. And, we've also seen where, some developers say, well, I'm going to add extra mechanical space in the base of the building. I want to lift the height of my building up. Well, the city really doesn't pay attention that this is dead space. They're just going for gross. They utilize gross square footage, and they look at other entire rental buildings and use gross. So these buildings really get penalized enormously because the city assesses it based upon its gross area, and some of the gross area is totally unusable. It's just excess mechanical. And then the reason the city does it is, look, if it were amenity space, well, somebody, if you're enjoying the use of a pool or a big health club, they want you to pick it up. That health club is going to be a common element and isn't going to have an assessment or tax associated with it. It's imputed into your individual units. And that's why the city utilizes gross to do a fair apples to apples when they're evaluating buildings. And when they do arrive at this overall assessed value, then they have the question of, well, how are we going to allocate it amongst all the various units? There was a time when they would do it on relative sales prices set forth in the offering plan, but more recently, and then they switched that. They went to percent interest in common elements. So that leaves you with a choice now. Do I take the entire G line that's all, let's say, 1 bedrooms, all the same size up and down the building, and assign the same percent interest in common elements, or do I gradually raise it up as I go up the building? It's going to impact, one, their carrying costs, the other expenses the building has that they're paying on a percent interest common elements basis, but the real estate taxes follow suit. So it will also drive the real estate taxes up if you assign a greater percent interest in common elements. Big difference as to whether you're taking an existing new building that you want to, you take it over from a failed developer, or you're converting a building. Typically, when we see a conversion of the building, very important to look at that assessment at the onset. There are some failed office space buildings that carry enormous assessments, and they don't really drop them very quickly. And the reason this has happened is you could have had an old tenant in there with a long-term lease that was paying above market. Over the years, they were picking up escalations, and the city was utilizing that entire income stream to value the building, and these assessments become enormously high. All of a sudden, that lease is over, the tenant's out of there, and you're sitting here with an empty building with an enormously high assessment. Well, it's not going to, if the city were logical and they would listen to a fair argument, they would bring that assessment down right away. But it's just not what happens. And it's not the case. These assessments tend to be very sticky. And you have numerous instances where we can't, it takes literally years. The process is that you go to the tax commission, and they typically, you can sometimes work out a good resolution and get some interim relief, but you never get what you're really entitled to under that type of scenario. We have had success where we've had new projects that were already, were assessed as residential buildings at aggressive levels, and contemplation that it was a perfectly wonderful project and was going to go forward like all the others do. But when it ran into trouble, we have gotten temporary relief from the tax commission. Would say, all right, we understand it's not coming off as anticipated, and they've given us that break. And of course, to those prospective buyers, they're going to look through to the offering plan letter, because at the time that they're buying, if the building's not complete, they don't know. No one knows what the taxes are going to ultimately be. And so you look to the letter where a firm like ours will project what real estate taxes will be upon completion of construction. But every one of these letters, you'll see enormous carve-outs, because the lawyers don't want to get sued, and the variation of assessments is wild. Very similar buildings can have vastly different assessments. And the city, and when these instances do come up where they overly aggressively assess a building, they're also not inclined. They're very difficult in trying to bring it down to its appropriate level. So when you read the letter, you'll see that they're saying, look, if the city were really to assess this in the full amount they could, and when I say that, we spoke earlier, the law provides that they are to assess it as if it were a rental. Well, wow, if you look at some of these rents on these luxury buildings, they are enormously high. It's not uncommon to see $125 a square foot as a rental level. If you impute that, you deduct ordinary operating expenses, which might be somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 per gross square foot, and you capitalize it at a rate of return, and the city's been using 6.7% as a rate of return, you end up with an enormous assessment. So we have rental buildings out there. The rental buildings tend to have, rental residential buildings tend to have, the new ones, higher assessments than the condominiums. The city actually as high as these assessments I told you about are, they're actually worse on high-end rental buildings. And the reason for that is if you own a rental building, the law requires that every year you have to supply the city with your income. So, and a computer simply, you file it on an electronic form, RPIE, due June 1st every year. And the computer there will grab that income, deduct the expenses, capitalize it. And the computer doesn't sit there and go, wow, that's a lot of taxes. It just, boom, kicks the number out, and you're paying 12.267% of that number. And it's you know, an enormous dollar number. Certainly, you know, anybody who comes from a different jurisdiction and comes to New York City is just wowed by the level of taxation that we have. Some other thoughts on this is recently, as recently as a week ago, the IDA and the EDC had put together a joint program called MCORE that they just announced, just had a seminar on it yesterday, and the forms are available today. It is intended to be for existing office buildings. However, and they want them upgraded, and they're giving up to a 20-year abatement, which is potentially an enormous benefit, but no residential allowed. So if it's going from commercial to commercial, there is a new program that just became available today, essentially, that one could look into. On a bright side, the legislature just passed two Assembly and Senate version of a bill extending the condo abatement program. So given our very high real estate taxes, if the building pays prevailing wage, and if this is the unit owner's primary residence, and they buy it in their own name, not an LLC, they can apply for it and obtain a 17.5% deduction on their real estate taxes, which would be very helpful. And it looks like that's going to be in effect, at least we can, for the next 4 years. The legislation hasn't been signed yet, but I think everybody anticipates it will be. We have had, you know, people come to us and say that they'd really like to operate it as a rental, a converted building, but they plan to get $120 a square foot plus, you know, crazy numbers, and we tell them what the taxes are going to be. Well, what if I make it a condo and I sell 15% of those units and declare it effective, and I retain the other 85%? Yes, you still are required to file that income and expense information with the city, but the city doesn't really utilize it correctly. They don't know how to interpret. They don't utilize it. So again, we find condos, if it's a condo, it's going to have a lesser assessed value than a high earning rental building. However, I think that rental group has gotten very shy recently because of the real threat that some form of a non-eviction, a no-cause eviction law will get enacted. And I know Stuart could probably speak to that a little bit. So if no one wants to get hung up renting out an apartment where you can't get rid of the tenant. Okay, I think I covered it. Oh, you're on mute now, Stuart.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I just want to remind everybody that the webinar goes at least till 12:15. I'm sorry, 1:15. We already passed 12:15, so there will be plenty of time for Q&A when the presentations are done. Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. One of the critical steps when dealing with revamping a condominium project is a review of the offering materials, which really touches on all of the aspects that the other panelists have discussed today. In New York State, condominium units are considered securities under New York law, which requires that you file an offering plan, which is a prospectus material with the New York Attorney General's office. In reviewing a distressed project, it's important to assess what stage the project is in with respect to the offering plan. If the offering plan isn't accepted for filing with the AG, we look critically at the draft of the offering plan and we review all of the components, which I'll discuss in further detail. But if it is already accepted, the threshold question is then to determine what stage of sales has occurred. If there are no contracts, it's much less complex. The AG will allow for a developer to file an amended and restated offering plan. Otherwise, you could file a standard amendment to the plan. But with an amended and restated offering plan, you have a really great opportunity to look critically at the project, as so many of the other panelists have mentioned already, so that you can make sure that your project is properly positioned to be successful. We typically recommend amending and restating because with that opportunity, you get a complete fresh start. Buyers are not provided with prior plan material that was accepted prior to the amended and restated plan. So you really have a chance to kind of bring the project back with a fresh start and begin again as if, you know, the prior developers' plans hadn't occurred. If there are contracts, however, the new sponsor then needs to really assess how they're going to amend the plan in a way that keeps those buyers in contract and doesn't give them any sort of rescission right that the AG could require if certain components are revised, which I'll touch on. So we look critically at an offering plan and we look at a few really critical components, among others. So those critical components include the budget, the real estate tax projections, the architect's report, special risks to the purchasers, the sponsor principal, and the condominium declaration. In reviewing the budget, this is really where the developer is going to take a really hard look at what the project is going to look like when it's operational. In an offering plan, you include a budget for the first year of condominium operation. And this budget is particularly important for two reasons. The first is that a sponsor is required to have a closing by the end of that projected budget year. And if there are buyers already in contract, those buyers are offered a rescission right if no closing occurs with the original projected budget year. Additionally, the budget can't increase by 25% or buyers are offered rescission. So both with, you know, a newly projected budget and with buyers who are already in contract from an old budget, you're going to look at both of those numbers very critically to make sure that you're not going to have a situation in which you either increase the current budget, you know, if you have buyers in contract by 25%, or if you're creating a brand new budget from scratch, that you really have accurate numbers so that you don't have a situation 2 or 3 years down the line when the project is nearing completion in which you realize that you've, you know, have inaccurately projected what your budget is going to be. Additionally, the sponsor is going to look critically at, you know, ways to reposition the project. They're going to look at, you know, as others touched on, staffing plans, amenities that may, you know, be brought into the project, some sort of concierge services, brand partnerships. All of these items are going to require disclosure and they're going to require, you know, a real hard look at the overall cost to the buyers. Additionally, you're going to obtain a new tax projection letter that reflects the projected real estate taxes for that new year of operation. We're also going to take a really good look at the architect's report. Typically, that report has to be completely redrafted. You know, as Peter touched on, the project probably is going to be revamped, which means that various construction components are going to change. The materials used in the project are going to change. And even the more important minute details for the buyers, like finishes, appliances, fixtures, things that are going to go into their apartments, they have to be accurate and they have to be represented correctly, because if they are not, that could become a really critical problem with a buyer. In reviewing the offering plan, we're also going to take a detailed look at the special risks that were previously disclosed. The Attorney General requires that we disclose to buyer any you know, material risks associated with purchasing a condominium unit from an offering plan. We look carefully at these risks. We want to ensure that the developer is adequately protected with as much disclosure about the various, you know, potential twists and turns that really could occur in a construction project. And we also take a look at, the various risks that occur throughout the transaction with the buyer. So, for example, a buyer may enter into a contract and not close on a unit for another year or two. And in that time period, things could change. For example, transfer tax rates could change. We had, in New York City, the mansion tax increased recently. So, you always want to be sure that you're providing disclosure and protection to the sponsor so that there isn't a scenario in which a buyer could have a rescission right because there was a lack of disclosure. The AG also requires disclosure of a principal of the sponsor, which is somebody who has day-to-day control over the sponsor entity. Typically, if you have a distressed project where a lender or an equity investor is taking over the project, they weren't the original disclosed principal because they didn't previously have that type of control. So we're going to take a look and, try to figure out the right, person and individual who's going to be disclosed for this purpose. This is critical both from a legal perspective, but also because this person could also become, the face of the project from a marketing perspective as well. It's important to, correctly disclose the right individual. And lastly, we're going to take a look at the structure of the actual condominium and the declaration of condominium, which is actually the document that will survive the project once the project is successful and fully closed. We're going to look at how the physical components are allocated, what is, a common element, what's considered a residential common element, who's responsible for what portions of the building. We're going to review the structure of the board, the voting structure, the members of the board and how decisions are made within the condominium. And lastly, we're going to look if there's, a commercial or retail component. We're going to review the rights of those owners vis-a-vis the residential unit owners to make sure that, the building can function in a harmonious manner where everybody has, protection and rights to the extent that they need them. These are just some highlights, but I hope I've shed some light onto, what we're looking at from a legal perspective in order to have, a successful project. I mean, the process of revamping an offering plan for a distressed asset is thorough, but it's really provides an opportunity for a new developer to reposition a project in order for it to be successful. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me give the CLE information at this point. The materials to get CLE credit are in the chat box for attendees who want to apply for CLE. And the number in New York is HK 23 0608 7445. HK 23 0608 7445. Let me add a couple of comments with regard to the presentation. I want to thank all the participants, the really terrific information, and of course the great job they do every day. I want to make note that in terms of reuse of existing buildings, a lot of these buildings were built prior to 1961, when the modern zoning resolution was put into effect, and buildings whose square footage exceeded the amount of allowable square footage were grandparented and were allowed to maintain the excess space as long as 75% of the building was not demolished. So if your intention is to tear down part of the building and then build a different building, if you don't leave at least 25% of the original building in place, you're going to lose the right to reuse the overbuilt portion of the building. So yes, if you tear down 76,000 square feet of a 100,000 square foot building, the building will not be able to be 100,000 square foot. It'll wind up being whatever the zoning law permits. Of course, the building can also be underbuilt so that additional space can be added, which is what we did with one Fifth Avenue office building that my clients reimagined into non-office use and then added additional floors onto the top of the building. Reusing office space does not mean that the entire building has to be done. In multiple instances, we've altered several floors of office buildings to convert the office space into residential, hospitality, medical centers, charter schools, and even homeless shelters. Theoretically, the reuse of an office building or really any kind of building should cost less and be faster than demolishing the building and then constructing a new building on the site. But as Beth pointed out, this also now plays an important role in protecting the environment. Demolishing a building that has been in place for a century or longer requires dealing with the detritus of the demolition, which throws carbon and other dangerous elements into the atmosphere. And those elements include asbestos, embodied carbon, and the contained energy in the existing building. Moreover, constructing a new building requires extracting natural resources, which are limited in their existence, in order to build the new building. So being able to reuse a structure offers many opportunities for having a profitable and important, while playing an important social function. All of these buildings that we've reimagined require different kinds of work to accomplish the ultimate goal. When we negotiated the separation of the top third of a landmark office building into a residential use, we had to figure out how to get the construction workers and materials from the ground upstairs and the detritus of the construction out of the building, while the lower 2/3 of the building and the lobby of the building were being used as for office space. And what we did was we decommissioned 2 elevators, and so had all of the material go in and out through the basement, up the elevator shafts into the construction site. It was complicated, it was time consuming, but we're able to get it accomplished. The issue of elevator shafts and plumbing lines are very important if you're not redoing the entire building, because you can't really put in cost effectively new elevator shafts. And of course, the plumbing requirements in an office building and the needs in residential space are totally different. So you have to be very creative in how you lay out what the new space is going to be like in order to be able to reuse as many of the aspects as possible. The articles in the newspapers about reusing buildings have primarily focused about the fact that the floor plates are too large and there aren't operable windows, but there are ways of getting around that. However, the issues of things like plumbing and elevators are critically important, and you have to work that into your planning, which is why you need a talented architect like Peter involved in the process. But it's not just, as I said, it's not just redoing an entire office building into a different use. We're just completing a process right now where we're taking 10 floors of an office building and converting it into a campus for a university that is basically going to be using that part of the space for those needs. We've also done this with malls on Long Island, where we've turned them into expansions of medical facilities. What we have learned in all of these projects is that with imagination and money, any building can be just transformed and not demolished. Again, I want to thank you for your attendance at our webinar. We will be doing another one next month, and I look forward to seeing you at them. And thanks again to the participants. Have a great day, everyone.